So for this tutorial we're going to be looking at the loop stitch, and to get started we need to create our foundation chain. This can be done in any multiple you like, you just need to add an extra chain on the end for turning. So for this tutorial I've chained 15 and then I've chained an extra one, so 16 for turning. So to get started, the first row is super easy. It is a row of single crochets. Now I'm using US terms. If you crochet using UK terms, this is known as a double crochet, but I will leave a link for a conversion chart down in the description box below. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to use US terms. To get started, we need to crochet in the second chain from the hook, so not counting the loop on our hook or the first chain, straight into that second chain with a single crochet and a single crochet in each chain along the row until you reach the end. So I'll meet you back once you have a row of single crochet and we'll move on to the next row. Once we've completed our row of single crochets, we need to chain one and turn our work. Now this is the row where we're going to start our loop stitch, and our loop stitch is always worked on the wrong side of our work. So to get started, we're not counting our chain one as a stitch and we're working our loop stitch in the very first space here. So you're going to insert your hook as you would for a normal single crochet. Now the length of your loop is determined on how high you hold your finger or your piece of yarn, or where you grab your piece of working yarn. So it's comfortable for me to hold my yarn like this, but if you hold your yarn similar to this, then you just need to work with the piece of yarn furthest away from you to make that loop. So I like to hold my yarn like this when I'm creating my loop, so I'm still holding my yarn between my fingers as I normally would, but I'm using this back piece of yarn here. So when we insert underneath our stitch, we'll have this V on our stitch, and we actually want to work over the yarn, not under the yarn as we normally would. So hook over your working piece of yarn, and then you need to grab your yarn from behind and pull that through. Now this here is your loop, and this is how long your loop will be. Then using your working yarn, not your loop, your working yarn, you just want to yarn over and pull through to finish that as if it were a single crochet, and then you can take your finger out of your loop, and that's your first loop created. You kind of want to keep all of your loops the same length, so make sure that you match up when you create your next loop. So straight into the next stitch for our next loop, so under that stitch, and we're yarning over that working piece of yarn and grabbing our yarn from behind and pulling it through our stitch to create that loop. Now you can always take your loop off your finger at this point and hold it down if it's easier to then work with this working piece of yarn. Sometimes it can be a bit fiddly because we're holding yarn, we're working with yarn and it's all fingers and thumbs. So we're finishing off our single crochet by yarning over and pulling through, and in our next stitch again we're going to work a loop stitch. So over your working yarn and grab that yarn from behind, pull it back through your stitch, and you can take that loop off your finger if it's easier, and then hold it down, just hold it down on this side and bring up your working yarn, and then you can yarn over with it and pull through that stitch. I'm just going to show you what these loops are looking like. So from the front you can see that our loops are starting to form. That's our working yarn, and they're all roughly the same size. We're holding our finger in exactly the same way. If you are doing rows and rows and rows of loops, then it doesn't matter too much if they're not quite the same size, because the loops above will fall onto these loops anyway. But if you're doing just a single row of loops, you want to aim for them to be the same size. If you have one that's really short and one that's really long, you're going to notice. So I'm going to show you the loop stitch one more time, and then if you need to practice you can pause and rewind the video, and I'll meet you back at the end of the row, show you how to move on to our next row, which is another super easy row. So insert your hook into the stitch, yarning over your, so you hook over your working yarn and grab the yarn, the strand from behind, and pull through the stitch. Now you can either bring up your working yarn or take your loop off your finger and hold it down at this point, and then use your working yarn to complete that stitch as it were a single crochet, and you've created your loop on the other side. So I'm going to leave you now to create your loops, and I'll meet you back at the end, and I'll also let you know what you can use your loops for. So I'm at the end of my row now. I've created a row of loops that are on the right side of my work, and so I'm just going to chain one and turn my work. So you can see all your loops here. And when we go back along this row, be careful not to crochet into your loops. As you can see, some of my smaller ones here are not quite holding down. So just make sure you hold them down as we move on. So we're only creating loops on the wrong side of our work. So when we're turning onto the right side of our work, we're creating a row of single crochet in each stitch along the row. So into each of the stitches, make sure you're holding those loops down and inserting into the stitches, not into the loops, all the way to the end. And then when you get to the end, you're just going to chain one and repeat that loop row again. And that is the pattern repeat. So it is a row of loops and a row of single crochets, chain one and repeat. So rewind the video if you need a refresher. Work on practicing those loops. They do take a bit of time to get used to. This stitch type is great for things like cushions, or you could have it as edging of blankets. I've definitely used it on 2 cushion covers before. And you can also use it in amigurumi for things like lion manes, and to give texture to fur and things like that. So it's a really, really lovely stitch, and it has a lot of variety. So go away, pause the video, rewind it if you need to, practice this stitch. Remember to show me your swatches and your stitch types over on Instagram. I'm Heb's Home Crochet over on Instagram as well. I'll leave a link in the description box below. If you like this video, please subscribe and give it a massive thumbs up, so you can join me for the next tutorial. I'll see you then.